Right, so we now come to the last presentation of the day, and I'm delighted to invite Marian Barton to give this. And again, this talk will very much be focusing on the survival issue, which is, of course, such a key interest of David's. Marian has been a member of the SPR for many years. In fact, Marian was originally, of course, Marian Ellison, the wife of Arthur Ellison, and all the SPR people have heard, of course, about Arthur, and his role in particular in the Scott case. But she has had a great interest in survival in her own right for a long time, and indeed, Marian and Arthur used to spend a lot of time investigating cases together. And since Arthur's death, she's continued to be most interested in the subject, and she is in fact now on the Survival Research Committee. She's also played an important role because she was in charge of what's called the Bridge Trust, which were funds left by Bernard Harrison for survival-related research, and that has now become part of the Survival Research Committee's remit as well. So she has a lot of experience, but in particular, of course, she was also a close friend of David's as well. And so I'm delighted to ask her to give her talk entitled Psychical Research, Survival and Spirituality. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Like the other speakers, I'm obviously very delighted to be here, having been asked by Bernard to say something about David, and also include the Skoll report. David seemed to me to have an inner quality, and in his presence there was a sense of spiritual contentment. Although he could still convey a great enthusiasm, and obviously particularly for the paranormal. David was a person who had practiced meditation and encouraged others to do so. One of his books was The Lotus in the City, How to Combine Spiritual Practice with Everyday Life. And that was how I saw David, a person whose spiritual side was part of his everyday existence. He suggested that whatever kind of meditation you used, it must involve some time spent in self-investigation and self-discovery. He said that self-observation and mindfulness could be used wherever possible in place of distracted thinking, and that patience and determination are two of the best friends on the journey. And that's how David was to me, very patient, but determined to carry out his set task. David said that he could not remember a time during his early years when he was not concerned with unseen things. He said that he had a strange joy, an inner certainty that life was not bounded by the mortal body. On one occasion, when still a child, his consciousness expanded outwards until it became the very centre of everything. Another time, when lying in long grass on a summer's day, everything became suffused with an extraordinary happiness, as if the hillside and the high summer afternoon were the spontaneous creations of his own mind, and time itself had suspended its breath. This awareness of sensation of time was important because he was usually acutely conscious of living in a time-haunted world, where each moment slipped through his fingers before he could grasp its magic. As a child, religion caused more disturbance than comfort. Everyone else in the Welsh chapel he attended appeared secure in their faith, whereas he felt he was the one person who did not have the right credentials. This was more to do with spiritual unease, a failure to derive any benefit from the chapel. Release came suddenly to him when he was about 9. He decided that the only important thing was whether or not he believed in God. The things that mattered were inside him. The earnest sermons about living the good life seemed to him so self-evident, but he could not see the need to go on about it. David said that we need to develop and live our personal myth of the journey towards enlightenment, which I think he was always endeavouring to do. Now I want to talk about the Skull Report, of which you've heard a little bit about it already. This is a 320-page proceedings, and David was one of 3 authors who wrote a proceedings which was published in 1999. The other 2 authors were Montague Keane, known as Monty, who died in 2004, and Arthur Ellison, who died in the year 2000. And they were all 3 members of the SPR and very experienced investigators of the paranormal. This proceedings is an account of an investigation into a range of physical phenomena which took place with a mediumistic group in a village called Skull in Norfolk. The group came to the attention of the SPR partly by claims made in the first issue of The Spiritual Scientist, which was published by the New Spiritual Science Foundation, operating from Robin Foy's home in Skull. One interesting statement there said that only now, when all the right factors and ingredients had come together to enable the work and plans to come to fruition, had it become possible to give effect to an objective originally planned by spirit communicators nearly 50 years earlier. And this plan was to include special sittings for intellectuals and scientists to quiz the spirit team and thus assimilate a wide range of knowledge about spirit communication and the exciting scientific experiments in the pipeline. And so Monty was asked to investigate with them to see whether it was appropriate for the SBR to be involved and also whether the group would agree to their involvement. He reported back saying that what was shown to me was either the product of a conspiracy of outright lies perpetrated with the aid of extremely ingenious and complex deception, or else it constituted the most impressive evidence of physical paranormality of which I have knowledge. And so it was agreed that the SPR would attend their sittings on a regular basis, and the 3 persons chosen by the group were Arthur, Ralph Noyes, who at that time was the onset of the SPR, and Monty. David joined the SPR investigators after the first 2 sittings and took the place of Ralph. The group made it plain that their priority initially was to concentrate on those persons likely to bring scientific experience and methodology to the experimental sittings. And the Skull investigation lasted from October 1995 to August 1997. When the SPR started the investigation, the members of the Skull sittings, called the group, consisted originally of 6 people, headed by Robin Foy. It was in his house that sittings were held, and Robin was the founder in 1990 of the Noah's Ark Society, which is still flourishing. And David and Arthur gave lectures to that society in 1997, both talking about physical mediumship. So the Skull group was Robin and his wife Sandra, and 2 trance mediums, Diana and Alan. And during the first 2 sittings, others were present, Bernetta Head and Ken Britton, who had been attending the sittings for 2 years. They travelled 170 miles twice a week to be present, but they'd had enough after all that time. And they were interviewed afterwards, and they testified to the genuineness of the phenomena. In the report, it states that the SBR team had heard nothing to suggest that any of the group had ever been caught in fraudulent activities. And I think that with all the comments about that you will hear later, I think it's going to be in Psychic News, which is coming back, some criticisms. You need to remember that. They were never, ever fought out. And the two mediums were already known to an SPR member who was their neighbour and friend. And she sent a letter to the SPR just saying about their simple life and how the mediums were keen to stay out of the limelight so that the group could concentrate on producing good evidential phenomena and messages from their spirit friends. The report covers 19 sittings when at least 2 or 3 of the investigators were able to be present. In addition, Monty had 2 solo sittings, 4 sittings when accompanied by other SPR members, and 4 sittings when accompanying the group in California and Ibiza. At the Ibiza sittings were also Walter and Karen Schnittger and Hans Scheier. Walter and Karen Schnittger also had 4 sittings at Skoll, and one with them was also Hans Scheier. David attended 1 sitting with Ingrid Slack, and her report of this is included in the book. And various other SBR members also attended some of the sittings. But during this time of the investigation by the SPR, the Foys also continued to have twice-weekly sittings, which in the report are called closed sittings. So the SPR members were there as invited guests by the group and the team. And this is the list of the team. These are the spirit communicators. But you will see that all the names are apparently pseudonyms, so that no one could check up, as you can in family history these days, so which was, I thought, rather a pity, actually. There had been considerable discussion before the sittings began about the kind of controls which would be acceptable. The group made it quite clear that the conditions under which the sittings took place were those required by their spirit friends and were not decided by members of the group, and the SPR investigators must accept them as they were. David, in his book entitled Is There an Afterlife, says that the important thing is not whether or not one can dictate all the conditions for experimental work with mediums, but that one is alert under the conditions that obtain to recognise whether any possibilities for trickery exist. The main problem, of course, was the absence of light. Robin Foy had said it was the intention of the team to bring their own light, and to some extent they did. But it was considered by the team that the premature introduction of artificial light would slow down developments. All the precautions against deception, freely discussed with the group and team, were designed to compensate for this shortcoming. Procedures changed slightly as experience was gained. Even though the conditions were not ideal for the investigation, it was decided that hoaxing, for whatever motive, would appear pointless, and it became clear to the investigators that exposure or revelation would spell personal and professional disaster for all members of that group. So this is the Skoll cellar. The séance room was in the converted cellar at the home of the Foys, which was almost entirely below ground level and effectively soundproof. The investigators were usually invited to take time inspecting the cellar before a séance. Other sittings were held by the group in other countries, such as Spain and the USA, and Monty was present at those. In these cases, obviously, the group could not prepare the room beforehand, but they just made sure that there was adequate blackout arrangements. Other locations made little difference to the phenomena produced. In the early sittings, Monty took notes in shorthand of what was going on, but they later managed to persuade the team and the group to allow tape recording. Members of the group wore Velcro wristbands, carrying luminous strips which had been charged up by exposure to electric light beforehand. And they also, or the SBR investigators, were allowed to look at these Velcro strips as well. They had also noticed that the Velcro strips, when removed, there was a very distinctive beeping sound. There were also small luminous strips placed at the 4 cardinal points of the compass on the circular table, a luminous strip on the ping-pong ball when present, and a luminous marker at the base of a string of bells. These were normally the only location guides that sitters had, save when sufficient spirit light allowed some visibility. Any changes in the position of a wristband would indicate the movement of an arm or hand. Although the luminosity of the strips tended to decline during the sittings, the sound of the Velcro provided some safeguard against removal of the wristbands. And guests were always asked to leave all electrical equipment behind in the living room, since it was feared that such additional electrical equipment might imperil the communicating mechanism. The investigators have been told that these experiments, in which a novel type of pure energy was being developed, and they would not be seeing the old kind of ectoplasm. And Joseph, one of the communicators, who they said was one of their scientists, that said that the main object of their experiments was to achieve successful, repeatable results. One of the main communicators was Emily Bradshaw. Her voice was clear and rather formal, and sounded like an upper-class English lady. In the first sitting, Patrick was comparing the process of communicating with the experience of jumping into a bath of custard, when Mrs. Bradshaw intervened by wondering what the researchers will make of a bath of custard when it is written up. So it seemed that the team obviously thought there would be a formal report. So many different kinds of phenomena were produced, and I was giving you just a taste. This is my choice. Obviously, someone else doing this would perhaps choose other things. So first, the lights. It was a spirit light, a small, bright speck no larger than a pea. It appeared in various parts of the chamber and would illuminate from inside a Pyrex bowl, which was on the table, then would go up to the ceiling, then would appear beneath the table. It could go through a hand or arm. It would touch the investigator's head, which Arthur said was like a tap, but a very distinctive tap on his head. The light would appear inside the ping-pong ball, which was ejected from its position inside the Pyrex bowl onto the table to the far side of the room, to be discovered on the floor after the session. The light could create a diffuse glow around the hands and knees of the sitters, which enabled their hands and sometimes faces to be seen by the investigators. David asked the light to enter his body, and it struck him in the centre of his chest and disappeared. He then felt pressure in the middle of his palm, and the sensation was pushing outwards from within his palm. A moment later, the light reappeared, as if from his chest. David held a glass of water, and the light agitated the water visibly and audibly without being extinguished. David's face being immediately above the glass, precluding unobstructed entry of any physical device. When Professor Grattan Guinness, an SPR member, was a guest, the light settled on his open palms. He then enfolded the light inside his hands for a moment to satisfy himself of the absence of any physical link. The light could take the shape of a large glass marble, which then rolled across the table to one of the investigators, producing enough light to illuminate his hands. And the light illuminated the fingers of the full-size spirit hand, which the recipient described as soft and cool to the touch. Now, I found this interesting, that sometimes the light could be seen by one person, one sitter, but not by the person sitting next to them. And obviously, Arthur, being an electrical engineer, was fascinated by the lights and often described their antics to me. So how could the lights be produced in any normal manner? The investigators dismissed the idea that anyone there had a concealed rod through which was threaded a thin wire with an LED at the end, and it would need a handheld mechanism for increasing or diminishing the luminosity. The light had appeared on the top of the table and then underneath it, which they considered was impossible by normal means without being detected. However, included in the report are comments on the investigation by Professor Donald West, Tony Cornell, and Dr. Alan Gould, all experienced SPR researchers. And Donald West said that floating lights would have been more impressive had the effects been directly viewable by thermal imaging devices or infrared cameras, which of course had been refused by the team. Sometimes there were forms or shapes. The sitters saw the silhouette of a full-size hand as it grasped a crystal, or levitated a crystal, or gripped the Pyrex bowl, illuminated from the inside by a spirit light. David and Arthur both experienced a hand and the fabric of a gossamer dress. A spirit hand grasped the front of David's sweater and pulled it gently but firmly away from him and over and above the rim of the table, an action only apparently possible by normal means if one of the group had climbed onto the table. Before the sittings with the SPR began, Monty had been shown photographs which the group said had been produced from images made on film negatives by the team. The group said the first photographs had been taken in the dark by one of the group with a camera using new 35mm film and without a flashlight. The shutter button had been pressed at intervals commanded by the spirits via one of the two mediums. The film was processed commercially and 11 images were produced of varying quality. And the next time they had two cameras, both loaded with film, and they had to leave it unattended on a chair. And when developed, each roll of 24 exposures was found to contain 11 pictures of various places, and the team said they were copies of old and new photographs which existed somewhere in the world. Monty had discussed with Dr. Richard Wiseman, now professor, an SPR member who specialises in psychology and the practice of deception, the kind of protocol likely to pass muster with skeptics. Dr. Wiseman provided a security bag, guaranteed to be fraud-proof, in which an unopened tub of film could be placed. At the second sitting, Monty had taken the bag to the séance room and it was discussed with the team, who thought that they would not have too much of a problem with it. And they also discussed the relevant films they considered to be suitable for the experiment. At the next sitting, Arthur placed an unopened tub of a Polaroid film bought by Monty into the bag, which he sealed and then took it down to the cellar, placing it on the floor between the feet of Arthur and Monty. When upstairs again after the sitting, they put the roll of film through the electric developer. The results were projected on a large screen and showed mainly star-like scatters with occasional lines, inconsistent with any horizontal scratching which might have been caused by the development process. Sadly, the poor quality of the film made copying difficult and later could not be found amongst the group's archives. And it appeared that the group really did not fully realise the evidential value of the film with the improved controls by the SPR investigators. On another occasion, again Monty bought a Polaroid film. The package was opened by Arthur and Monty placed the tubbed film on the table in front of himself, and this time not in the secure bag. When developed, the film did show some Greek lettering. However, as the investigators said, the controls were not actually ideal on that occasion. On the sixth sitting, Monty had 2 more packs of unopened Polaroid films. Monty gave a tub to Arthur, one of the films, who placed it in a large plastic security bag provided by Dr. Wiseman. It was agreed that the second film, of a type not previously used, would be left on the table in its tub, and David signed a piece of white gummed paper, which he fixed to the top of the tub. The security bag was placed on the table, so that the front edge just allowed the luminous table tab to be visible, while the opposite side of the security bag was against the edge of a plinth bearing a glass dome. The film in the tub was placed under the glass dome in the centre of the table, as this procedure had been agreed by the team with the group in one of its closed sittings. During the sittings, several scuffling sounds were heard as though something was entering and exploring the bag. Then there was a noise of dragging, as though the whole bag had been transferred to the other side of the table. And Emily said it had been lifted over the top of the dome, and when the session ended, it was found to be on the other side of the table. It was agreed to leave the bag on the table, placed below the plinth, for the supposed spirit energies to work on, since most of that sitting had been taken up with discussion and light displays. In the next sitting, about a month later, the bag was found to be scratched in places, but not otherwise marked. And when the film it contained was developed immediately after the sitting, it proved a disappointment. There were again night sky stars on what would normally have been the first 2 or 3 exposures. And to that extent it was evidential, but they were unimpressed and thought that if the team were involved, they appeared to be having difficulty getting through the plastic of the bag. And they were later informed that the 3 layers of plastic were an obstacle. However, they noted that the film leader, which normally projected a few centimetres, appeared to have been wound back into the cassette. The second film, still in its paper-sealed tub and signed by David, when developed, contained handwriting almost along its entire length. The investigators named this the diatimer film. The handwriting consisted of 2 closely related messages, which they considered provided possible evidence of the role of Frederick Myers. The first message consisted chiefly of a poem, written in 4 lines across the length of the 12-frame film strip. This was followed by a sentence, "Ce n'est que le premier pas qui coûte," translated, with my poor French, "it is but the first step that counts." Then there was a stanza written in script across the 4 long lines. The second message consisted of cursive Greek letters, and at the end of the film were 2 names. The group made arrangements for the film to be copied, but the images were fading rapidly after only 3 weeks, which the technical department at Polaroid said was unusual. But they did manage to get a computer-enhanced impression of it later. Before the investigators had found the origin of the messages in the film, the team at a later sitting gave them some clues, again apparently referring to Frederick Myers. And the team seemed to enjoy teasing the investigators and giving them puzzles. Emily Bradshaw suggested they look at Human Personality, Volume 1, page 250, written mainly by Myers but published after his death. And halfway down on this you will see the sentence in French. Later in the same session, Emily, after a request from David, gave them further clues to the word diatimer. Emily said, "I can tell you Mrs. Verrill and Mrs. Forbes had the test word from a certain gentleman." David said, "From Myers," and Emily said, "Quite right." David then said, "Diatimer? In the cross correspondences, was it?" And David asked whether Myers was involved and was told by Emily very much so. So this and other clues enabled the investigators to solve the mystery of the images on the film. The diatomer case was what purported to be a message derived from hints separately received by Mrs. Verrill and Mrs. Forbes by automatic writing during the cross correspondences. In the school sitting attended by Walter and Karen Schnittger and Dr. Hans Scheier, images appeared on a film which were German words resembling wie and Stau in handwriting. This was a film they had bought themselves, and Walter had control of the film the whole time until it was developed. And at another sitting, just with the Schnittgers, a German poem was produced on the film, although the controls for that were not quite as good as the previous one. The last major experiment with the group by all three SPR investigators was in August 1997. Monty had asked for recordings of spirit messages on tape, but where separately they would be able to hear any comments by them, the group, and the mediums. Monty had bought a packet of audio tapes, and David made identification marks on one of the tapes in 4 places. They had the Panasonic tape recorder, which had been used previously in an experiment with Monty and the group in Ibiza. Arthur confirmed that the microphone had been removed and that there was nothing in it which could record sound. Arthur replaced the batteries and gave it to Monty, who then demonstrated that the recorder could play a pre-recorded music tape. Monty then inserted David's blank tape, and he spoke a few words with the record button pressed and played it back to demonstrate that there was nothing being recorded of his voice. And David had made a thorough check in the séance room that there was no hidden electronic equipment before the others joined him there. David then plugged in a lead connecting the microphone-less recorder to a primitive semiconductor apparatus which Arthur had designed earlier as specified by the team. David kept the machine under his continual visual observation. The recorder had 2 bright luminous tabs on the start and play keys. David pressed the start button when requested by the team, and Robin Foy started the recorder to record the sitting, and the 2 machines rang together for the next half hour. After a number of comments from all present, including the team, Emily Bradshaw said that Monty was going to have a treat that night. Edwin, one of the team, said that he is going to bring some music, but it's very special. The composer is going to play it himself. Emily said that that was a projected memory for him, the composer. There was a harsh white noise coming from the microphone-less recorder, but also music and a voice message over it. Monty recognised it as Rachmaninoff's 2nd piano concerto and was deeply moved. He later explained that this was one of his first pieces of classical music he knew, and that he had been raised on Rachmaninoff's own recording on 78 before the war, and that this music had helped him when he was a lonely evacuee. After the sitting, they played back the tape, which had been in the microphone-less machine, confirmed by David as the one he had marked, and it had recorded the Rachmaninoff as well as a message plus a large amount of white noise. Robin Foy's tape recorded all that was on David's tape, as well as all the talking by the group, the mediums and the investigators during the session. David's tape did not have any of the talking by those present. And I think with all the controls exercised by the investigators, this was one of the better paranormal events. However, it was later suggested that a pre-recorded radio signal had been secretly beamed from either outside or inside the room, probably via a microtransmitter, and received directly onto a tape in a recorder from which the microphone had been removed. Therefore, the SBR investigators reviewed the evidence but eventually decided that the radio signal suggestion looked improbable. Soon after the sitting in August 1997, the SBR investigators were informed by the team that they wished to concentrate on other experiments and were unwilling to repeat early experiments. They considered that there was ample material to produce a report. However, the investigators did ask the group to be allowed to repeat 2 or 3 experiments with more adequate controls, and they had a lengthy meeting with the group, who still refused any further sittings with them. Over a year later, the group said that they had received a request from a more elevated set of communicators to cease all sittings entirely. In the report is an additional response from David. He goes through each of the comments by Professor West, Dr. Gould and Tony Cornell. Dr. Gould said that some of the images on the films are taken from recognisable sources, and he regards this as suspicious. But David disagreed, as the Skoll group had made it clear from the outset that their communicators specifically stated that many of the images appearing on the films were from existing sources. The group themselves were indefatigable in hunting down these sources, seeing them in effect as examples of the puzzles that the team seemed to enjoy setting. Dr. Gould also said that a major part of the supposed communications from deceased SPR members contained material reasonably accessible to the public. All 3 investigators were disappointed that the communicators did not supply more obscure information. But David said that, assuming that survival is possible, there is no way of knowing how much of Earth memories are retained. David again says that, having written numerous papers and more than 20 books, he thought that if in the next world he was asked to produce some detail of something he had written, he would probably fall back on one of his better-known books. David also comments on his previous experience. He was well aware of what could be done with LEDs, with fibre optics, with lasers, with extending rods and with secret panels and other devices. And he felt that he and Arthur and Monty were exceedingly experienced investigators and would certainly be on their guard against any possibility of being hoaxed in any way. And David said that those reading the report must decide whether or not the shortcomings in protocol are sufficient to invalidate over 200 man-hours of careful observation and the many safeguards that did in fact operate. David published an article in the Paranormal Review in 2006 giving an update on the Skoll report. Monty had also made contributions to this article before his death. David said the fresh criticisms had been conspicuous by their absence. He said they had offered to provide assistance to anyone who would attempt to replicate the phenomena by normal means and under the conditions prevailing at the time of the sittings. They did not have a single show of interest at that time. However, correspondence they received demonstrated support for the conclusion that the phenomena were genuine. One such was from an SBR member, Guy Playfair, who indicated that there was an anomaly in the recording on the audio tape of the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto. This was an erroneous repetition of a cadenza, which he thought was unlikely to occur in any recording of the piece. As you've heard, the Skoll report has just been reprinted. And we actually thank in large part all the efforts of Anne Harrison of Saturday Night Press Publication, who helped enormously with the publication and production of it. If you have not read it, I would certainly recommend that you do. And it was available downstairs, and I think there are some copies still there. David made a difference to the lives of many people in his work, but also with his various books on dreams, on how to meditate, and the many articles and books on the paranormal, including Life Beyond Death. On the blurb of this book, he said, knowledge of the afterlife and how we can prepare for it is essential. Think how foolish it would be to depart for a distant country, knowing nothing about it, and carrying no route map or guidebook. Well, David has made that journey, and I feel sure that all his experiences here enabled him to make the transition with knowledge. It has been suggested many times that what happens to you in the next world is shaped by your ideas of that world. And I would think that all David's experiences here with the paranormal would give him an interesting existence.